Hi, and welcome back. Once again, I'm Rich Walter, Vice President here at CIE, and this is another video in our series about the 2019 Israeli elections. Today I'm joined by my colleague Eli Sperling here at CIE and the Emory Institute for the Study of Modern Israel, and our topic today is the intersection of Israeli politics and culture and society. So thank you for joining us for the series, Eli.
Thrilled to be here.
And to start off, can you explain how Israeli politics have been represented in popular culture over time?
Sure. So, in understanding the connection between Israeli politics and culture, we really have to go back to before the time of the actual state of Israel, looking at the formation of Zionist national culture in Palestine. And as soon as immigrants started coming from Europe in the 1880s, it was central to the mission of Zionists to come up with a unique Hebrew culture that would help build a Jewish society in Palestine that would form the nucleus of what may become a state.
And this is especially considering the many diverse places that Jews were living.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course, it's important to remember that upon initial immigration to Palestine, Jews were coming from Europe, even certain Jews were coming from Yemen, and not only did they need to create a common language where everyone could speak the same language and not have to rely on Russian or Yemenite Arabic or any of the source languages that people brought with them, they also had to define a new cultural reality that everyone could have as something to help make them a uniform society as they were forming in Palestine.
And so how did institutions make this happen and connect it to the political life of the Yishuv? So
first and foremost, some of the original institutions promoting culture were educational institutions. In 1906, the Bezalel Academy of Art was established in Jerusalem. In 1912, we have the establishment of the Technion Technical College. And then in 1918, we have the establishment of the Hebrew University. And so first and foremost, there were institutions of higher learning that were educating individuals both in the Hebrew language and on various facets of culture. During this period of time, we also start to see unique Hebrew folk music developing in the Yishuv, meaning the Jewish community in pre-state Palestine.
And does that folk music end up getting tied to different political streams as they emerge?
This happens later. At the turn of the 20th century, a lot of the folk music was revolving around different Jewish holiday rituals as envisioned by the Zionists, connections to the land, and talking about more general connections between the Jews and the land of Israel. But as we start to move into the 1920s and 30s, we start to see institutions like the Jewish National Fund, the Histadrut, which was the original office that represented the labor union, and other organizations start to use cultural output and cultural materials like Hebrew folk songs or pieces of Hebrew literature to even educate immigrants in the Hebrew language as they came, but more broadly to educate those in the Yishuv on the emerging aspects of Hebrew culture as they were being defined.
And how did this change a little bit after the formation of the state?
So after the formation of the state, first of all, there became more definite and finite cultural institutions, and we start to see more schools popping up around the state of Israel that specialized in specific aspects of culture, but we also start to see political movements break off and become stronger and have containers put around them, and political movements started to have music that would represent their platforms. Now, this began in the 1930s. We can see this most clearly represented by the song Shir Beitar, written by Zev Jabotinsky, and songs about the land of Israel written by Rachel HaMeshoreret, or Rachel Bluestein, for example, singing about the land of Israel. And there we can see the foundations of folk songs representing labor Zionism versus more nationalistic songs representing revisionist Zionism. And this later turns into cultural materials that are more supportive of labor politics in Israel and then supportive of a Likud outlook. But we can see these origins really sitting in the 1930s.
Right. And then into the early 50s with the statism or Mamlachtiyut period, how did it evolve in those early years?
So, first of all, we can see that the government led by the labor parties, first of all, wanted to control what aspects of culture were being promoted in Israel. So, for example, in 1963, British pop sensation Cliff Richard came to Israel and performed for thousands of young Israelis. And Ben-Gurion and other politicians associated with the Labor Party were actually frightened by the positive reaction and the type of dance that they saw demonstrated by young people.
Which is why the Beatles weren't allowed to come.
And so in 1964, when concert promoters wanted to bring the Beatles to Israel, it was actually made a debate on a national level, and the government had an office that controlled what culture was being let into the country and not, and they decided that a planned 1965 concert for the Beatles in Israel would not be allowed.
So the government really used culture as a way to sort of develop this sense of Israeliness in the early years of the state and manipulated some of that control.
100%. And we can also see this represented in the many bands that were part of the Israel Defense Forces. We can also find these origins in the pre-state period. For example, the Palmach band, known as the Chizbatron, was one of the major performing ensembles in Israel, and as we move into the Mamlachtiyut period, the statist period in the 1950s and 60s, we see the relevance and importance of these military bands in Israeli society in fact grow. And when the first television station is established in Israel, it's very common to see military band performances of folk songs in Hebrew.
And what about literature during this time period?
So in the early years of Mamlachtiyut, we can see a lot of literature that's actually promoting the statist agenda of Ben-Gurion and his associates. Moshe Shamir's book, With His Own Hands, Elik's Story, is a wonderful example of this. Now, this story was written by Moshe Shamir about his younger brother Elik, who fell during the War of Independence and died. And this book, recounting Elik's story and really painting a picture of heroism and ultimately Israeli values on heroism and military might, being required reading in many Mamlachti schools and many statist schools in Israel. And so we can see literature that is being produced and actually mandated for students to read that essentially promotes many of the ideals of the statist establishment.
As Israel developed and matured as a country and struggled with integrating some of the different Jewish minority groups, and as they themselves found political representation, how did that lead to a greater acceptance of their culture in the wider society?
It's a great question, Rich. So looking at this period of Mamlachtiyut in the 1950s and 60s, in addition to the political realities and the Labor Party's grasp on the government, we also see a huge influx in Israel's population, where nearly 1 million Jews from Arab lands moved to Israel between the period of 1949 and the end of the 1960s. Now, this group of Jews came from much more traditional societies where they were more religious, and in that regard clashed with the secular socialist ideals of the Mamlachti Party.
It was in many ways Israel's first sort of racial issue, white and brown Jews really coming into conflict with each other.
And also coming into ideological conflict with the state and especially the religious practices of many of those Israelis already there. And in addition to this, they brought with them Arabic culture because they came from Arabic-speaking countries, and this meant Arabic music, this meant the Arabic language, and there were many attempts in Israeli society to acculturate this community into the Mamlachti ideals of what was secular Israel at the time. However, it took a period of time for not only this group to find political representation, but also to have their culture become part of the mainstream. Now, a major watershed of this was in 1977 during Menachem Begin's campaign to be the premier of Israel. And during this election, when he unseated the Labor Party for the first time and was the first Likud candidate, a part of his political success was reaching out to the Mizrahi Jews in Israel and telling them that he wanted to provide them legitimacy both politically and culturally.
And did his election help bring their culture to the mainstream?
So I don't know if we can necessarily find a direct corollary between the election and the proliferation of, let's say, Mizrahi music, but there is certainly a connection. For example, in 1977, when Menachem Begin won, in part due to his outreach to the Mizrahi community, within a couple years, we start to see Mizrahi music become commercially available. Now, prior to this period in the late 1970s, while there were many Mizrahi Jews listening to Mizrahi music and performing it at life cycle events like weddings and bar mitzvah receptions, really the only way that you could actually purchase recorded Mizrahi Hebrew music was on bootleg cassette tapes in bus stations in the periphery of Israel.
Sure.
However, in the late 1970s, following Menachem Begin's election, Habrira HaTV, one of the first major Israeli pop bands that perform Mizrahi music, led by musician Shlomo Bar, releases their first album in 1979. Followed soon after that, in 1981, by Zohar Argov's iconic album Eleanor. Now, a year later, we have one of the first TV performances of Yemenite Israeli music in Hebrew when Zohar Argov performs his iconic song Perach Begani, or Flower in My Garden, on live television. And many Yemenite Israelis will in fact tell stories of their parents or grandparents actually crying tears of joy seeing Argov's performance and hearing that Mizrahi musical aesthetic.
And in more recent decades, have we seen similar maturation among the Ethiopian and the Russian immigrant communities as well?
Sure. For example, with the Ethiopian parties, in 2006, the Ethiopian party that came to politics was called Atid Echad, or One Future. Now, within a few years of this party coming into politics and subsequent outreach from some of the more mainstream political parties like Shas, offering them a political voice, we can see Ethiopian music likewise become more part of the mainstream. And in fact, in 2011, a young woman named Hagit Yasso, who is the daughter of Ethiopian immigrants, won the popular Israeli singing competition show Kohav Nolad, or A Star is Born. And after that, we start to see more Ethiopian artists become part of mainstream Israeli culture. The band Cafe Shachor Chazak, or Strong Black Coffee, being an example of this with their contemporary hit Yehiyeh Beseder.
And we've talked a little bit about the impact of sort of these Jewish minority groups. How about the Arab minority community and their interplay between the Arab-Palestinian community and their interplay between politics and culture?
Sure. So this is a community, the 20% minority of Israel that are Arabs. They occupy an interesting, let's say, liminal space, meaning they sit kind of teetering between multiple cultural realities. On the one hand, they're Israeli citizens, and so they're isolated from the Arab world, being Israeli citizens, but they're Arabic-speaking Arabs, and so they're not necessarily fully a part of Hebrew-speaking Jewish Israeli society. And so for this group of Israelis, it's often the case that they will listen to Arabic pop music that is produced outside of Israel. Now, this also means that participation in music competition shows, much like Hagit Yasso in Kohav Nolad, means that they may have to leave Israel to participate in an Arabic music competition show.
Like Arab Idol, right?
Exactly. So we have an example in 2014 where two Arab citizens of Israel, Haitham Khalili and Manal Musa, actually snuck out of Israel and got papers drafted in the West Bank to allow them to travel to Beirut to be a part of the competition and actually audition for the show. They moved through the first rounds of the competition and were actually selected to participate in the taping of the show. Now, when they came back to Israel from Beirut, they were met by Israeli security services who in fact took their passports away and were not going to allow them to leave Israel again to participate in this competition in Beirut, considering that Lebanon is still an enemy state of Israel. And it was actually, in part, the intervention of certain non-government organizations and certain Arab ministers of the Knesset who leaned on the security establishment to give them their passports back and let them go participate in Arab Idol. Now, they did not win, and they did actually participate representing Palestine as they had it and not Israel. But this also further shows the complicated nature of the Arab Israelis in relating to the rest of the Arab world, where they can't necessarily be representing Israel.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about sort of how the political establishment has influenced culture, but what about vice versa? We see certainly in the United States during times of political campaigns, artists from different aspects of culture use their platforms and celebrity to promote one ideology or another. Have we seen that similarly happen in Israel?
Sure. There are many examples of this, and much like you would find in the United States or any country for that matter, you are going to have a very wide range of political opinions amongst those cultural influencers who are within your society. A really illustrative example of this is actually following the June 1967 war, where Israel as a society was pretty divided on what should be done with the territories acquired during that war.
And still is today.
And yes, this is still very much a hot issue and a very contested issue that we can see many artists, scholars, and other influential members of the cultural community in Israel weighing in on. Now, in September of 1967, in a very famous case, there was a group of left-wing literary and academic figures who decided that they would take out an ad in the traditionally left-wing Haaretz newspaper to promote their idea of immediately returning those territories acquired in the June 67 war. And on the same day, on September 22nd, 1967, there are a group of more right-wing literary and academic figures who produce a similar ad in Ma'ariv, another newspaper in Israel, where they make a case for maintaining what was known as Greater Israel. In other words, the Israel known to the world between the years of 1949 and 1967 within the 1949 armistice lines, but additionally those territories that were acquired in the 67 war. And so we can see here that literary and academic figures were in fact opposing each other in a very public manner.
And in looking at the Emory ad, it was interesting to see that Shai Agnon, Israel's first Nobel Prize winner, was one of the signatories of that Greater Israel concept at that time.
Sure, yeah, and it's a very illustrative look at that division and even tension between the various political camps within the cultural community in Israel.
Sure.
Now, we can see more examples of that moving into the future. Another really great example of this is a song that in 1969 was actually pretty controversial in Israel. This is the song Shir LaShalom.
Made famous by Yitzhak Rabin.
Exactly. Now, well before Yitzhak Rabin famously sang that song in the rally in Tel Aviv before he was assassinated, the song was performed in 1969 by an IDF band. Again, connecting the IDF as an institution to cultural output. Now, there were many in the military leadership that felt that this song about peace was actually not appropriate for a military band to perform at that time. However, as we move forward in Israel's history, the song in fact becomes an iconic element of the peace movement, and we see Rabin performing this song with Miri Aloni, one of the singers who originally performed the song in the late 60s and 1970s in Israel, but the song in fact became the official political anthem of the left-wing Meretz party in the 1996 election, which they ultimately lost to Benjamin Netanyahu heading the Likud party. But again, we can see many examples over Israel's history of cultural influences taking a political stand, and this included singers like Aviv Geffen representing the left wing in Israel in the 1990s, and even today a rapper like Subliminal, who very much represents the right-wing political parties in Israel and releases many songs that are, in fact, promoting a very right-wing and nationalist agenda of what he feels is the best path forward for Israel, considering all of the tensions with their neighbors. And so, much like any other country in the world, we can see
the artists
culture
are represented in all aspects of the spectrum.
100%, and we can see a direct tie between culture and politics.
So my last question, Eli, is how have some of these more iconic works, that have been culturally important from Israel's history, represented some of these different political moments, and which ones would you recommend for our viewers to, really dig deep into?
Sure. So for most of the conversation, we've focused on music and literature. I think Israeli film is one of those areas where we can really see these tensions being played out on the silver screen. And what is interesting is that a lot of the iconic films of Israel's history that have even taken a relatively controversial or even critical stand of the Israeli government have in fact been funded in part by the Israel Ministry of Culture and Sports. And so one of the first really important films in critically looking at the political situation in Israel was Ephraim Kishon's iconic comedy Salah Shabati.
Israel's first Oscar-nominated film,
And they likewise won the Golden Globe for that. Chaim Topol, who goes on to play Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof and many other films, has a really breakout performance on the international scene, playing a character named Salah Shabati, who is a Mizrahi immigrant to Israel with a large family that spends the first portion of his time in Israel in a transit camp, or a ma'abera, which is where many of the Mizrahi immigrants were placed for periods of time during this period where Israel was going through economic hardship and didn't have the resources necessarily to quickly build housing for 1 million immigrants. And in this film, even in a very comedic capacity, they start to pick apart some of these tensions that were really the foundation of the arguments that were going on in Israeli society between the Mizrahim, who felt in many regards let down by the Israeli government, and the Israeli establishment that felt that they were doing what they could within their means and with their vision of the state. And this film, which became an international sensation, really highlighted these tensions, even in a comedic capacity. And in many ways, I think, changed the way that Israeli society and the world thought about what was happening domestically in Israel.
Other films that you think would be good representations of some of this? I think we've seen in the recent, maybe past 10 years, especially when it comes to war movies, similar to in American culture, movies that shine a critical light on, say, the Vietnam War. I think we've been seeing that also in terms of some of the more acclaimed Israeli films and taking a critical look at some of Israel's wars in recent decades. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the first major films that likewise gets international acclaim was written in the mid-1980s about the June 1967 war. This film called Avanti Popolo, which was also put up as Israel's bid for an Oscar during that year, highlights some of the tensions surrounding the war and, in fact, is set on a story following Egyptian and Israeli soldiers lost wandering through the Sinai Desert in the aftermath of a battle there. But more important to contemporary discussions about Israel, the film Waltz with Bashir, that
Great.
is looking at the issues surrounding the 1982 war in Lebanon, which was controversially also funded by, in part, the Israeli government, takes a very critical look at not only the war itself, but almost more importantly, what impact the war had on Israeli society. And I think was a moment when not only those veterans of the 1982 war in Lebanon reflected upon their war experience, but I think it was a moment when many in Israeli society who are part of a country that has mandatory military service got to really reflect deeply on those traumas that were associated with their military service, especially for those that actually served in combat zones. And I think that film in particular really highlights a rich conversation in Israeli society about the military. Now, much more contemporarily, we have a movie called Zero Motivation, again, in part funded by the Israeli government, that in a very comedic capacity shows what young people today really think about the Israeli military. Now, this isn't representative of all young Israelis, but it does show the often monotony and, you know, kind of boring day-to-day life of a jobnik, as they're called, meaning someone in the Israeli army who just has an administrative job, and for these few years when they're 18 to 20, 18 to 21, serve in an office and are very much a part of the military establishment, but are having a very different military experience than many people would associate with the Israeli army. Many people think that soldiers in the Israeli army are out there fighting in battles or manning checkpoints, whereas the reality is that most people have either logistical or administrative jobs that can be quite mundane. And so this film, in a very comedic capacity, highlights what it's like to be a young person and be in this monotonous, bureaucratic institution that controls your life for the first few years of adulthood.
And just to finish up, I think it's fascinating that you've really highlighted how so many of these films, even those that can take a critical look at Israel, often receive significant funding from the Ministry of Culture and Sport. And we've certainly seen in the last government, Miri Regev from the Likud party, as the Minister of Culture, try to use that position in a way to influence how some of that cultural capital is spent in the country. You just touch upon that a little bit because it's been kind of controversial.
Sure. So Miri Regev has been a very controversial figure. She started her career in the Israel Defense Forces and then moved to politics. And what is really interesting about Miri Regev is, on the one hand, she certainly represents the Likud platform and has a much more right-of-center approach to culture in Israel, especially as the government sees it, than many on the left or her counterparts in the labor parties. However, she also is of Mizrahi descent. And so while she works to promote certain right-wing Israeli agendas, one of which being providing financial incentives to cultural groups, whether it be a dance troupe or a musical ensemble, to actually perform in the West Bank.
In the Jewish parts of the West
Bank. In the Jewish parts of the West Bank, yes. Certainly not performing for Palestinians, but performing in settlements in the West Bank. And she is actually working to simultaneously put forward economic penalties to those artistic and cultural groups that refuse to perform in those communities. Now, these very controversial aspects of her platform have garnered international criticism. However, she is simultaneously working to promote Mizrahi cultural agendas, including providing extra funding to musical ensembles that are performing Mizrahi music. And so we can see her, on the one hand, lifting up Mizrahi culture, which for the Mizrahi community they felt was debased essentially by the Ashkenazi political establishment in the early years of the state. But on the other hand, she's using her platform to promote agendas that are very controversial in a political sense, both in Israel and around the world. And so her position as the Minister of Culture and Sports is very illustrative of many tensions within Israeli politics and society, but she is one of those figures that people do love to hate, especially in the left-wing media in Israel.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us for this look into the intersection of culture and politics in Israel, and we'll see you with our next video. Thanks.
Thank you very much.